My name is Jean Hardelesa Mijares, Program Manager for the Climate and Disaster Resilience Program of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and I will be serving as your host for today's session. It is my honor to welcome you all to the third and final session, at least for the year, for our webinar series, Climate Voices on the Ground, Perspectives from Different Sectors. If you joined us in our previous session, it's great to have you back with us again. Today's session is titled Climate Risk and Microenterprises. This webinar series is organized by the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, which is hosted by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. My Climate Risk, or MCR, is a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, which aims to develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to regional climate risk. This starts with a better understanding of local context and the requirements of decision makers. Hence, our webinar series, where we will explore the different contexts and experiences of climate change. Today's session in particular will focus on microenterprises. Just some reminders before we start. Please note that the program is being recorded on Zoom. On Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. Throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions in the chat box here on Zoom, and participants via Facebook Live may also type in their comments or questions in the comment section. We will collect these for the open forum later on. And finally, there will be an event evaluation form at the end of the session. A request for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form. At this point, we would like to ask everyone to settle in for the prayer to be followed by the Philippine National Anthem. Let's pause in silence for a few moments. Interfaith prayer for our climate. May I be a protector to those without protection, a leader to those who journey, a boat, a bridge, a passage to those desiring the shore of non-suffering. May the pain of every living creature be completely cleared away. May I be the doctor and the medicine, and may I be the nurse for all sick beings until everyone is healed. Just like space and the great elements such as earth, may I always support the life of all the many creatures. And until they pass away from pain, may I also be the source of life for all the realms of varied beings that reach into the ends of space.
Magiliw, pelas ang sinanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Now, to formally welcome everyone to today's session, it is my honor to share the message of Dr. Philip Arnold Puanyo, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government and a collaborator of the MCR Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub for the opening remarks.
Good afternoon. I wish to welcome you all to this webinar entitled Climate Risk and Microenterprises, being organized by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, or AIS, as part of its activities in hosting one of the Asia-Pacific hubs of My Climate Risk, which is a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, an international program which aims to coordinate climate research. The aim of the My Climate Risk program is to highlight the perspectives of different stakeholders and communities in their experience of climate change and how they're using climate information in addressing climate risks. One of the sectors in the Philippines affected by climate risks are microenterprises, which are defined as businesses with less than 10 employees and with assets of less than 3 million pesos. More than 90% of all businesses in the country are categorized as microenterprises and are typically engaged in industry, agribusiness, and services, and they are registered as single proprietorships, cooperatives, partnerships, or corporation. They are mostly engaged in wholesale and retail trade, and also in accommodation and food services. Thus, they are able to absorb a significant number of unskilled workers, which account for a large number of workers in urban areas. In the agriculture sector, more than a tenth of revenues are generated by these types of firms. These microenterprises are important in the country because they bring in goods and services to far-flung and underserved communities. They expand the markets in which larger types of firms have been initially not taken advantage of. Despite their importance to the country's economy, microenterprises and home-based enterprises are affected by many of the disaster risks, especially typhoons and flooding, in terms of damages to property and equipment and the closure of these firms. Some enterprises are able to cope as their owners receive remittances from family members or friends, or they're able to undertake refinancing of their activities via loans from primarily the informal financial sector. However, the lack of information on how to mitigate disaster risks and their low capacity to undertake business risk assessments and business continuity planning remain barriers in ensuring that these firms are able to fully cope. As many of these enterprises are unregistered and lack business licenses, they are not able to take advantage of the limited public and private sector programs that address these business challenges, including insurance and government subsidies. I therefore thank the discussants of the webinar this afternoon, led by Dr. Assunta Cuyegkeng, former director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and currently the director of the Lili Gokongwei Ngochua Leadership Academy of the Gokongwei Brothers School of Education and Learning Design, and Ms. Raquel Cementina-Olpoc, Program Director, Master of Science in Sustainability Management Program of the John Gokongwei School of Management, who will be enlightening us on the situation of microenterprises and the climate risks that they face. They will be providing us with more information on how these businesses obtain and use climate information, and how can they be better empowered with this information. Thank you again to the AIS for organizing this event, and we in the Ateneo School of Government are one with you in your objective to widen awareness of the necessity of better climate information, especially among the most vulnerable sectors in the country. May we all have a fruitful discussion this afternoon. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much to Dr. Tuanyo. Indeed, microenterprises are among the most important sectors, but also among the most overlooked and most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so we're really looking forward to this session where their context in relation to climate risk is highlighted. It is now my pleasure to introduce the speakers for today's session. Dr. Maria Assunta Cuyegkeng is a professor at the Department of Educational Leadership and Management of the Gokongwei Brothers School of Education and Learning Design in Ateneo de Manila University. She is the Executive Director of the Lili Gokongwei Ngochua Leadership Academy and the ASEAN University Network on Ecological Education and Culture. In 2013, she helped establish the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and became its director from 2013 to 2021. Dr. Assunta obtained her bachelor's and master's degree in chemistry from Ateneo de Manila University and her doctoral degree in chemistry from the University of Regensburg in Germany. She has written on polymers, science education, environment, quality assurance, and leadership. Her literary essays, poems, and Filipino translations appear in various anthologies. Her current research and teaching interests are in the fields of leadership, systems thinking, social entrepreneurship, and sustainability. Ms. Raquel Cementina-Olpoc is an assistant professor at the Leadership and Strategy Department of the John Gokongwei School of Management and the program director of the Master of Science in Sustainability Management in Ateneo de Manila University. She is a graduate of Ateneo de Manila University with the degrees of AB Literature in English, a Master of Arts in Education, major in Guidance and Counseling, and a Master of Arts in Psychology with concentration in Industrial Organizational Psychology. Currently, she's doing research in social entrepreneurship, sustainability, leadership, and organizational behavior. Truly, it is a pleasure to welcome them today. Dr. Cuyegkeng, Ms. Cementina-Olpoc, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Jean. Let me just share our screen. There, I hope you can see our slides. No? So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for making time to join this webinar of for the My Climate Risk webinar series. You know, our interest on disaster resilience of microenterprises began in 2016. At that time, Abby Favis of AIS and I were fresh from orienting university and township groups on disaster preparedness. We had built our workshops on the materials that the late Dr. Gemma Narisma had shared with us. Then came a request from a Dutch business student, Irene van Doorn. She asked for placement as an intern at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. So what could she work on that would be of interest to a business student while highlighting a Philippine experience? One gap in our understanding is the disaster preparedness of micro enterprises in the Philippines. Irene, together with OSCI professionals, combed the micro enterprises in the Loyola Heights area, and her exploratory study paved the way for this research on profiling the disaster risk and resilience of micro enterprises. Today, we'd like to walk you through our work, starting with a brief review of the concepts of risk and resilience, the context of micro enterprises in the Philippines, the methods we used for data collection and analysis, the findings, and the implications. Although we are using the term micro enterprises because that is what is technically defined in Philippine agencies, as Dr. Tuanyo earlier mentioned, we are really referring to nano enterprises. Enterprises that have only one employee who is usually the owner-manager, or those enterprises that operate at the bottom of the pyramid. As with many organizations in the Philippines, microscale or nanoscale enterprises experience a good amount of risk resulting from extreme weather events. The 2019 World Risk Report ranked the Philippines as the 9th most at risk among 180 countries in the world when it comes to disaster. Disaster risk can be assessed by looking at several factors. The first is hazard, which is any situation or human activity that may potentially cause loss of life, damage to property, disruption of social and economic processes, or environmental degradation. Exposure is the presence of people, livelihoods, species, ecosystems, environmental functions, services, resources, infrastructure, and assets in places and settings that could be adversely affected when there is a hazard. And finally, vulnerability are the conditions that increase the susceptibility of a community or an individual to the impacts of the hazards. Thus, risk can be defined by the equation risk equals hazard times exposure and times vulnerability. Hazards can be natural or human caused. Exposure may be represented by the likelihood that the hazard will occur, and vulnerability by the severity of the impact of the hazard. However, this vulnerability can be offset by the capacity of the individual or organization to cope with the situation. This would include being prepared in terms of structure, systems, behaviors, skills, and organized response. Thus, risk can be better represented by that equation. Risk equals hazard times exposure times vulnerability all over capacity. Again, where likelihood and severity of the impact of the hazard are proxy variables for exposure and vulnerability, respectively. The capacity that balances the vulnerability is determined by resilience. Brian Walker defines resilience as the ability to cope with shocks and to keep functioning in much the same kind of way while coping with disturbance. Our experience tells us that vulnerability is often associated with economic capacity. Often, when we are exposed to the same hazard, the most vulnerable are those located in less protected areas, those living in poorly constructed homes, those who do not have the mobility to leave their homes when there is a pending hazard. Thus, it was important to understand the situation of microenterprises. Unlike bigger corporations, their coping capacity would depend on how much they invest in disaster readiness and business continuity. Microenterprises are often the main source of income of their owners, and if a major disaster befalls them, it takes them much longer to recover.
Microenterprises are defined by their size and number of employees. They are often family-based businesses and includes the likes of sari-sari stores, shoemaking, micro-agribusiness, paper bag production, garments, and others. The Department of Trade and Industry, or the DTI, reports that in 2020, there are 957,620 business enterprises operating in the country. Of these, 88.77% are microenterprises. These do not include some of the sari-sari stores and market vendors, which DTI estimates to be a total of 1.3 million, as well as an estimated 7 million informal and unregistered home-based micro-businesses. The registered businesses provide 5,380,815 jobs or employments. Of these, 29.38% of the total employment registered is from microenterprises. These data highlight the importance of studying Philippine microenterprises in relation to their disaster preparedness, if we are to genuinely plan for sustainable and inclusive development. Especially in the context of the Philippines, disaster preparedness can be defined as the extent to which individuals and organizations are equipped and ready to respond to negative environmental threats, particularly how these organizations take action before a disaster that enable social units to respond effectively when disaster strikes and undertakes measures in enhancing life safety when a disaster occurs, including the ability to undertake emergency actions to protect property and to engage in rehabilitation and recovery activities. It was found that micro, small, and medium enterprises, or what we call SMEs, are vulnerable in 4 fronts, namely capital, labor, logistics, and market or buyers, and only by developing the supply chain environment can SMEs be resilient themselves. Unfortunately, most microenterprises tend to operate informally and to work outside industry norms and regulations, which limits their capacity to adopt risk management tools. 3 factors contribute to the lack of preparation of institutions, namely first, financial and economic constraints, second, inadequate knowledge and skills, and third is complacency. Furthermore, respondents experience more losses from previous disasters, and those who perceive greater risk from disasters seem to prepare more. These affirm that awareness is positively correlated to a high level of preparedness. Our study thus seeks to contribute to the literature on disaster readiness of Philippine microenterprises and their capacity for business continuity planning, or BCP. We conducted 12 focus group discussions, The themes from these FGDs were analyzed using thematic analysis and descriptive phenomenology. For the FGDs, 8 were from Luzon, 3 in Visayas, and 1 in Mindanao. There were 102 participants, of whom 70% were female and 30% were male. Most were members of community organizations or cooperatives, or what we call samahans, and the range of their businesses are shown here. The data analysis showed 2 main groups of themes. First, those that show the vulnerability of microenterprises, and second, those that show their resilience. While most had a sense of risk from natural hazards, they did not relate the risk from their practices to their experiences of disaster. The clear examples from the micro-entrepreneurs were into farming or fishing. So for example, they mentioned the effects of proliferation of water hyacinths on their kangkong production and on their fish harvest. But they did not relate it to the practice of throwing laundry water into the lake. It has been known that such practices release phosphates that could lead to eutrophication. So on the slide, you would actually see the actual quotes that we got from our FGDs. Okay. So they're actually mentioning, they call the water hyacinths as water lilies, and they were looking at how it was affecting the fish and also one of their plants, one of their businesses, which is kangkong. Another question of practice is that of fish cages in a lake. They are more concerned with the destruction of the fish cages, which involve all the micro enterprises in the samahan or community organizations. However, it has been known that using fish cages can cause nutrient pollution and disease transfer. This quotation from the study of Vista and the co-authors on the practice of fish cages in Taal Lake highlights the complex interdependencies of practice, values, and events in the microsystem. Furthermore, micro-entrepreneurs experience the effects of extreme weather on their business. However, most do not directly articulate their concern for climate risk or climate change. There seems to be a gap between the concept of climate risk and the impact on day-to-day business concerns. These quotations stop short of connecting their experience to the changes in the environment, but there is a clear concern of losing their access to their supply or damage to access. The need to move to higher ground, and losing customers. Particularly the quotation on losing customers again highlights the interdependence of weather, customer behavior, accessibility of microenterprises, and business results. Although there are characteristics of microentrepreneurs that make their microenterprises vulnerable, there are more characteristics that make them more resilient. For example, they're very agile. They're very creative in looking for alternative resources using their skill, or what we call discarte. So in the slide, you'll actually see they're trying to look for ways of earning outside of their own microenterprises. So one is actually looking for a sewing garment, and the other one is actually looking for a product that is suitable to the weather during that time. They look for alternative modes of delivery, like using a boat if the roads are inaccessible. They use their creativity to find innovative solutions like modifying their structures. So they try to find ways to make their structures for their equipment become more stable. These past experiences have also taught them to be prepared. Although they may not have resources to completely relocate their business, they are able to relocate for the time the floods may reach them. They also prepare necessary emergency equipment or choose crops that will withstand the rains. Most microentrepreneurs are persistent in looking for ways to survive, usually by having multiple sources of income, or what we call sideline, or because they are agile by taking on another job. There was willingness to learn and adjust, especially about new ways of doing things. They also built their social capital by being active in their samahan. They are then able to use their social capital during their crisis. This is consistent with the studies that show how social capital strengthens the resilience of microenterprises. All these are consistent with the concept of adaptive resilience. Norris et al. States that resilience is the process that produces adapted outcomes. So by its nature, resilience is naturally adaptive. But the concept of adaptive resilience has been adopted especially for communities. Specifically, Tierney states that an adaptive resilience enables social units to reassess their circumstances, learn from their disaster experience, and adjust their strategies in the light of the new normal ushered in by the disaster. Our findings are also consistent of a study on the vulnerability and disaster resilience of 2 barangays in Kamalig, Albay, which shows that factors of trust, social cohesion, and sense of community involvement, respect for cultural values, respect for culture and values, and communication and information contribute to resilience.
So the findings show that there are certain competencies among micro-entrepreneurs that could be improved, such as raising their awareness on their practices, as well as their awareness on the general state of the planet. There are also competencies that can be further developed on the right, such as agility, preparedness, persistence, willingness to learn and adjust, and building and use of their social capital. We have also seen from the previous quotations that there is a complex play among actors in the micro-enterprise ecosystem. The micro-entrepreneurs repeatedly mention among the groups they interact with, the customers or their market, suppliers, family, and their samahan or organization. We saw that the micro-enterprise ecosystem is a social ecological system that has evolved as a result of the culture of the community, as Dybal and Yu will put it. Thus, the relationships among its elements can be organized using the cultural adaptation template introduced by Dybal and Newell. In this model, the 4 subsystems that affect each other are the activities of the microenterprise, the practices of the microenterprise community, the natural hazards and related effects on the ecosystem, and the disaster preparedness of the microenterprise community. Activities of the microenterprise include their operations, their access to their consumers or the market, their dealings with their samahan, and interestingly, the needs in their family. The inclusion of family as seen in their household practices was evident even in the exploratory phase of our study. The microenterprise is attached to the household, so there is no delineation between, for example, the water discharge of the two. The micro-entrepreneurs usually have no employees and rely on themselves and members of their family to run their enterprise. They also tend to use the enterprise's funds for family needs. The interactions of these subsystems can be translated to that model, which is the cultural adaptation template of Dybal and Newell. Effectively, the activities of the microenterprise describe the state of the microenterprises. The practices of the community describe the culture of the microenterprise community, and these practices include their value system, which include being able to share resources within the community and being resourceful when they make adjustments in their operations. The hazards and related effects describe the ecosystem. Among the most cited natural hazards are typhoons, heavy rains, flood, while most cited human-caused hazards include power outages, usually in relation to extreme weather, and eutrophication. The microenterprise community showed that most of them had some response prior to and during disaster. Some had plans for recovery post-disaster. These describe their disaster resilience. The resulting adaptation of the template of Dybal and Newell once again shows these 4 subsystems and their definitions. Let us now explain the links between the subsystems. The links are indicated by those blue arrows that connect the subsystems. A link describes how one subsystem influences another. Each of the 7 links indicate different processes. We could begin with a more detailed analysis of the links, but in the interest of time, we will focus on the main links among the subsystems. The first link describes how the culture of the microenterprise community influences the way it runs its activities. Their culture is very relational. So there are times when the resources of the microenterprise can be used to share with the community or with the family. The second link, on the other hand, shows how the activities of the microenterprise can affect the worldviews of the values and worldviews of the microenterprise community. For example, the dealings with their samahan proves useful, and these leads to their value of relationship building for social capital. Their loss of access to the market or loss of consumers develop a culture of discarte, showing their agility to shift resources, their value proposition, or delivery channels. The third link is about the activities of is about how the activities of the microenterprise can lead to disaster resilience. Protection of their assets and households condition them to prepare for disasters. Their dealings with their samahan help them through their relief and recovery efforts. The fourth link shows that disaster resilience of the microenterprise community can affect their culture, since agility, preparedness, and persistence eventually become ingrained in their values. The fifth link is about how the activities of the microenterprises affect the ecosystem, especially if the microenterprise uses nature as a direct resource. The practice of fish cages affects the health of the lake. The water discharge coming from the combination of both microenterprises and households leads to eutrophication, which is a problem in turn for the fish. Indirectly, each microenterprise contributes to carbon emissions, just like any other enterprise that uses transport. The sixth link is about how the state of the microenterprise ecosystem affects their worldviews and culture. Currently, the microenterprises experience natural hazards which contribute to their value of agility and persistence, especially in adjusting their practices for the good of the microenterprise. This is probably the link that could benefit from greater intervention, or as we saw in the thematic analysis, where competencies could be further improved. Proper learning and reflection about why the environment is the way it is could influence further their values and worldviews, enough even to change their practices. The final link looks into how changes in the ecosystem affects the disaster resilience of the microenterprise community. Their experience with natural hazards help them plan for the onset of these natural and human-caused hazards. We set out to understand the disaster risk and resilience of microenterprises in the Philippines. We found that while micro-entrepreneurs lack competencies that make their micro-enterprises vulnerable, they also have competencies that make their micro-enterprises resilient to crisis and disasters. While characteristics of the micro-entrepreneurs are important, there has to be a more systemic approach in helping to build their disaster resilience. Hence, it was important to understand the subsystems and links that constitute the micro-enterprise ecosystem. This understanding affirms the proposed interventions on raising awareness of the community so that they could modify their practices. Our work on microenterprises once again highlights the importance of going to the grassroots to find the best approach to wicked problems, like resilience and sustainability. Microenterprises and their communities experience the most severe impacts of climate change, and it is only through increasing their coping capacity that we can lessen their risk. Thank you. Thank you from both of us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Assunta and Ms. Raquel, for sharing your study on looking at the climate risk of microenterprises. At this point of the program, we will now be having our open forum. We have gathered some questions that were sent directly to us, but before we go to those questions, I just really would like conceptualizing microenterprises as ecosystems, and that's very interesting. Usually when we think of ecosystems, it's the natural ecosystem, but this time you shared microenterprises, their experiences of natural hazards, the state of microenterprises, how their experiences with these and the state of microenterprise affect their worldviews and affect their culture. Could you share more about what sort of worldviews you would like to highlight that you found talking with your respondents or engaging with the communities that might help with how they use climate information?
Raquel, would you like to start?
I think one way is actually they don't see how what they're doing is actually affected by the environment. So we need to help them realize that their business is actually also dependent on what's happening around them. So that's one thing that we need to help them realize.
All right.
I think their exposure, their worldview is, I'm not sure how you would call it, but they seem to be ready to accept whatever disaster befalls them, and that's why they adjust to it through their agility, through their Discarte. I just realized that we have foreign guests here. Discarte is like the way they position themselves in order to respond to a particular challenge, no? And it usually entails some innovativeness. It entails fast thinking. You have to think fast on your feet, and it's also digging deep into the resources. All of that coming together in that Filipino term of Discarte. But this is something that has been really shown practically in all the FGDs when we ask them about what they do during a disaster. So this is very much highlighted in their culture. On the one hand, they sort of accept the fact that things like that happen to them, but on the other, they are not giving up. They're very persistent, as we said, and they end up preparing for it.
Thank you very much. Can you share some of, we saw earlier in some of the slides, you have quotes that are in Filipino, but maybe you could share more about what these innovations are?
Raquel, go ahead.
Ma'am, can we show them the slides?
The
please?
slides. Okay, sorry. Let me just go back to the slides. Sorry, we did not translate them. We forgot that we would be having other guests. Sorry.
Recently, no problem. Just coming from the context recently that in Metro Manila, the community would usually be experiencing flooding, and so they innovated. They put some platform. They increased the height of their tricycle so that they still continue with their livelihood. So here, maybe we could share some of their innovation.
So the innovations. Sorry, these are not the innovations. Let's see. There.
Okay, so on the left side of the screen, actually, you'll actually see alternative mode of delivery. So what actually we're saying is that the quote is actually saying, if there's a flood, we can't really cross to, for example, to go to the market, or we can't go to our customers. So what they use is what we say here is magbabangka. They use a boat so that they can transfer. So in other words, they actually have they are prepared by having a different mode of transportation when there is a flood. Okay. The one on the right, innovative solution, this came from a person who actually has a water refill plant. So because his area actually gets floods, so what they did was that they placed wheels on it so that the water refill tank would be a bit higher, and it was also easier for them to hopefully move it a bit when there is water floods coming in. Okay, so that's one. And then for relocation of assets, the one on the upper leftmost quote, okay, they actually make sure that they take care of their items that they're selling. So pwede namin iligtas ang panininda namin because they know that they are beside the river. So they make sure that the items that they have will not be destroyed by flood waters. The one below that, yung isang paghahanda namin, this is they make sure that the production does not stop. So what they do is actually they prepare the supplies way beforehand and they go to a place where they can still continue production. While on the left, they actually have a second floor, so ikalawang palapag, and that's where they move their business equipment up there. And then they also invest in equipment resources. So the quote on the top, most on the left one, they have their own bangka, okay, so that they can actually
have their own boat.
They have their own boat, so that they can actually bring their things outside. They can go to the market because it's more expensive if they rent out a boat. So they invested in a boat, okay. While the next one after that is, this is still the water refilling station. He actually invested in a generator because they get brownouts, and when the brownouts occur because of the typhoons. Okay. And then the last one below, actually invest in a radio because the radio would actually help them get more information faster so that they know when they need to transfer. While on the rightmost side, they actually change the type of crop that they plant. So they choose a plant that they can that would survive the rainy season, and they plant it on high places that the water will not reach. So they relocate where they plant their crops. And then in terms of persistence,
thank you very much. Oh yes, please go ahead.
I think this is very
yes,
nice
please
for
go
the
ahead,
Filipinos.
Ms.
We are
Raquel.
they're very resilient. So the term for Filipinos is sideline, and sideline is looking for another work outside of your regular work. So for the one on the side, how do I explain that? They
Dried fish.
They dry the fish. Yes,
well, it could either be dried fish or it could be marinating it in vinegar so that it doesn't spoil. Yeah.
Yes. And then on the other side, if they cannot sell fish, she looks for another job like a caregiver. So that's another way of showing adaptive resilience. Do we continue, Ms. Chin?
Well, just to take off from you mentioned earlier the use of the radio because it's easier for them to get information and maybe to share information, and you also highlighted the one of the traits that make them resilient is really preparedness. So maybe you could share if ever this came up during your FGDs or engagement with the community, what are their early warning systems, or maybe a system with their LGUs, how they prepare for disasters and how that helps them cope when they have to move their paninda, the things that they sell, or when they have to activate their innovation so that their enterprise will not be much affected when a disaster happens.
Oh, go ahead. You remember? Yeah. They have the early warning. Yeah.
The early warning system is actually more on a communication basis. So they pass on the information informally. It doesn't, what I remember from the FGDs, they get information because we have samahans. And the members of the samahans, if the president gets information from the barangay hall, they pass on that information to the members through cell phones. Okay. So that's one that I remember.
And my memory from the interviews is that they don't avail much of they don't have that kind of a communication with the LGU. I mean,
the local
it's not
government,
really, yes, it's more the samahan that they rely on, the association, their community association. or let's say if they're garment makers, then their association for garment makers, or in the case of the one in Laguna Lake, then the ones doing fish cages, they have also an association. So that's the kind of social capital that they have with their organization.
Wow, so really the importance of social capital here highlighted again to help further with their preparedness. We have a question from chat and it reads, what are the specific ways to mitigate the inherent risks faced by micro enterprises as to protecting their assets?
I think, as we had mentioned earlier, they have found ways at the practical level. But what we're seeing is, as Raquel mentioned, there are certain things that they're not aware of that actually they're doing that have a negative effect on their micro enterprise. Like, for example, they live around the lake. That's why they have their fish cages, but they don't see that when they throw laundry water there, it increases the water lily, which they complain about. No, and at the same time, they also, the practice of fish cages, they're not very conscious of, for example, controlling the populations. They do not correlate that. So that's the kind of intervention that perhaps might be helpful to them, getting them aware of the relationships of what they're doing, their practices, and the impact. So understanding climate, understanding the planet better would be a good intervention, which is highlighted both from the thematic analysis and from our systems template.
Ms. Raquel, would you like to add?
On my end, I think what Ma'am actually said is more of the climate. So they are not seeing the cause and effect, their behaviors to the business. Okay. Yeah. But it's more highlighted for the agriculture or aquaculture. Rather than the retail.
And so, speaking of interventions and the need to help the community understand how systems in the planet work that might affect also their business, another question from chat, and also this related to another question that we received, so we'll just synthesize it here. How can climate scientists and others doing climate research better engage with micro enterprises in terms of helping raise awareness on risk and build resilience?
Raquel, you want to talk about that, the workshops, for example?
We actually did not include in our presentation the workshops. We actually, after gathering the data, what we did for the research was there were actually templates used. So we had, I think, 3 workshops. One in NCR, one in Visayas, and one in Mindanao. So after the FGDs, we walked them through on how made them realize that how their businesses actually is affected by the hazard. And then we actually asked them to realize how is this hazard going to affect their business continuity, how long would it affect them, and how much effort do they need in order to start the business again. So there are tools that we've created for that.
Yeah, so I think it's important for those doing climate research to be able to communicate those things in simple terms to the stakeholders, because often when we do research, they're very technical and only the scientists actually understand them. And so what it highlights for us is the importance of translating the work that we do into things that can easily be understood, communication, not just for the grassroots, but also for the policy makers, because sometimes if it's too technical, they do not really see the practical implications. It has to be, science communication is still a very important thing that we have to learn in pursuing this climate research. And I think what we've seen also is that the work, for example, of Dr. Gotanco Gonzalez on systems approach, I think that's a very good way of making them see the big picture. At least in one workshop that we did, when they saw, for example, how their business was running, and when they saw the connections, they seem to appreciate that, that they realized, this is what you mean by value proposition. This is how we are connected to how these practices or whatever. So I think they just need a little bit more exposure. And I think the kind of research, whether it's the climate scientists or the management people, bringing it to the level that they can understand will be very, very helpful.
Yes, thank you for that. Another question here reads, how do you see our micro enterprises coping, this time not with natural hazards, but related with the and rising costs of fuel, which can also be human-induced disaster? How do you see them coping this time with non-natural kinds of disasters? So you mentioned eutrophication. How about the ones that related to
the inflation, of course, no one, they have no control over that, but they tend to continue. What they will tend to do is maybe limit the stocks, the inventory that they have, for example, in a sari-sari store, or they also make use of their for example, the limited supply to increase their price when they sell to their market. So they also know that, no? So they can adjust. I don't know that there is much that wait, let me just check how can they cope. They really don't have much choice, because they just have to do it. They just live with that inflation, because there's no other option, because they have no other source of income. Either they do it, or they if they don't sell the goods that they do, then, as you saw, they would shift to their alternate sources of income. So they would do the sideline, the second source of income. But they really don't have much control over inflation, rising cost of fuel. So they'll just look for maybe a second source of income, I think. But these are things that they themselves cannot really directly address. I think it's beyond their control. Raquel, you want to add anything? Yeah.
I think we can share one FGD response. I remember that there was a group from Laguna who was saying that in times of financial need, the husbands go to Manila and work as carpenters or construction workers, while the moms stay in the province with the kids. So I think that's their one way of showing resilience also. They find alternative sources of income.
Yeah. Actually, their organizations are able to help them out also, but it's not because of the inflation. They'll not be given money to help them out, but it's really in times of crisis, like when they really need something during a disaster, or when there's a death in the family, then that's when they can really bank on their social capital. But really, inflation is not covered by those things. And as Doc Randy said, the concept of insurance is not really high in their minds at this point.
So talking about their samahan, their cooperatives, there's another question here, and I'll read from chat about preparedness. Are individual enterprises or sectors which are co-located willing to find collective solutions?
Yeah. Raquel, go ahead. I think you
Yes.
know this.
Okay. We had a group from actually one of the universities, and the samahan there actually worked together. And that samahan, actually one problem that they had was their food, how do I say this? Spoils quickly. Okay. So they actually asked help as a group to the university to help them find ways so that the food will not spoil. So they got training from that university. We also had an example of in another FGD, the group in that place worked together to stop a dam being created in their be constructed in their area, because if the dam happens, they're going to have floods in their area. So that was one way also that they work together so that it helps everybody.
Okay, thank
So
you for that.
in their culture, there is a lot of collective efforts among their community. So while there might be some competition, especially among the fish cages, at some point they do help each other. I remember the quote where if there is another person in the microenterprise community that needs something, that they're willing to share their resources. So even if they have limited resources, they are still able to share with each other.
It's good that you mentioned that. Another question is actually related to sharing of resources. Here, using plants that are weather resilient seems like a good way to introduce nature-based solutions. The one that Ms. Raquel mentioned earlier. Can this also be a good jump-off point to greater disaster literacy among the community, among microenterprises?
I guess so. I mean, I think for one, on the one hand, they complain of the water lily, but actually, or the water hyacinth, but actually there are so many studies that show that the water hyacinth is also a potential solution for the nutrient pollution. No? It can absorb all these metals, etc. That's part of the literature already. But again, there's no intervention to teach them that these are things that they could do, and of course, there's additional investment for these things. I know that there are some politicians that have tried to invest in teaching them livelihood coming from the water lily, but of course, that requires certain training, that requires a certain capital from them. And so if there is no third party that is willing to fund these things, I don't think they will naturally just go into it by themselves.
Would you like to add, Ms. Raquel?
I think Mama should actually answer that question very well.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a few more questions, if that is fine with Dr. Assunta and Ms. Raquel. Actually, this one is for you, Ms. Raquel. So you mentioned that sometimes your respondents stop short of connecting their situation with their environment or climate change. Is this a common pattern? Also for Dr. Cuyegkeng, you also mentioned that the state of the environment can help change the culture of microenterprises. Seeing as communication contributes to resilience, have there been information campaigns? Was this something that they mentioned during FGDs? And how can we make these information campaigns more effective way to address their problems?
I think the reason why we tried to do workshops instead of just communication is that you really have to engage them. They have to be immersed more they have to participate in the thinking process, in the analysis. So I think it's just that we could not do it for all the micro entrepreneurs. It also depends on the time that is available for them. No? But what we saw is that it is possible to have those interventions. So if there are groups who are willing to engage them, go to the grassroots and talk about climate risk in a way that really connects to their livelihood or to their homes or to their families, I think that would be a very effective way of teaching climate risk and climate change to them.
And actually, speaking of patterns and the use of systems thinking that you mentioned earlier, this is a personal question. I was wondering, were there challenges having to introduce to them doing systems thinking? How did you maybe address those challenges? I know doing systems thinking, it's very important to be able to help them link maybe a situation or occurrence with another variable. So how were you able to effectively engage with them through that medium?
We didn't do systems thinking per se the way, for example, we do it in Ateneo. But what we had was in our workshops, we would usually begin with what hazards have you experienced, and what have you done? How long did it take you to? And it's really more coming from them. And then if there is a chance, we ask them to list, for example, what do they do in their what are the activities that they do in the micro enterprise, for example. Just list the activities, and then we put it together. We show the links among their activities. We show first we show how their value chain works, and then we explain to them how it connects to the bigger picture. So it's not really strictly speaking, it's not the way we teach systems thinking, but because that I think that would have been difficult to teach in this particular context. But it's really understanding their own activities and the relationship with other things that they do. For example, even cleaning their sari store is part of what they think of. So it's so easy to connect it with activities that can have impact on the environment, for example, their waste management and stuff like that. So it's really them who think about it. We just sort of give them a nudge on how to make the connections. But I think what they value is understanding the language of value chain, for example, and then understanding that, okay, this is how we are affected by things that are beyond our control.
Wow, that's a really beautiful way of engaging with them, really getting into their worldview and trying to maybe visualize it for them so that you could further tease out maybe how environmental conditions affect them and how they affect it in return. We have room for one last question. Here it reads, interesting that Ms. Raquel earlier mentioned in times of disaster, men go to Manila, and this is the way we can connect micro-enterprises, gender, and climate migration, even if only temporarily. Since women seem to make up a great chunk of those in micro-enterprises, is there a gendered lens by which we can increase awareness of risk and resilience?
Raquel?
We actually did not look at gender in this study. We just realized that majority of our respondents were females, especially during the survey and the FGD. Even the presidents of the samahans were mostly female. So I think eventually we will have to study. I know there is a study on women entrepreneurs and how these women entrepreneurs actually do well in the business, but we did not touch that in this study.
Maybe one of the gaps to be filled for those who would like to do research further on micro-enterprises in relation to climate risk. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Assunta and Ms. Raquel, for answering our questions. And thank you also to our participants for your questions for this open forum. We now move to the awarding of the certificate. We present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Maria Assunta Cuyegkeng for sharing her time and insights in the webinar titled Climate Risk and Microenterprises on the 28th of October, 2022. The same certificate of appreciation is also presented to Ms. Raquel Cementina-Olpoc, also for sharing her time and insights in this webinar. Both certificates are signed by Jean Hardelesa-Mijares, Program Manager for Climate and Disaster Resilience of Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and Dr. Charlotte Kendragotang, Gonzalez, Director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and the focal point of the My Climate Risk at Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Assunta and Ms. Raquel with Microenterprises, making us aware about their needs, their climate information needs, and how we on climate risk and help them better with already their traits that help them become more resilient. To give the closing remarks, may we call on Dr. Emmanuel Delocado, the Program Manager for Sustainable Development Goals in the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability.
Thank you, Ms.
Dr.
Jean.
Delocado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Jean, and thank you everyone for joining this session. We have a very rich discussion in the last hour. The webinar series was organized to highlight the various perspectives on the experiences of climate change by various sectors, complementing the viewpoints of coastal communities and other highly vulnerable sectors of the first installments of the series. This one provided insights from voices on the ground, namely microenterprise, which, as we learned, function as a community. They comprise a vulnerable group as social enterprise is a major source of income among the owners. From the study done by Dr. Assunta Cuyegkeng and Ms. Raquel Cementina-Olpoc, we learned that lack of awareness of risk from practice of members of samahan or microenterprise communities, as well as lack of awareness of impact on climate change or climate risk to their businesses. While this is unfortunate, we also learned that they imbibe a mindset of survival and competencies that allowed the microenterprises to further develop and also to build their microenterprises to be more resilient. The mention of practices like fish cages and laundry discharges punctuates a necessity to further promote sound knowledge and systems thinking to the ground. Climate researchers have done a lot of groundbreaking work in the past decades. We, however, have to strengthen effective scientific communication to microenterprise communities and even beyond. With this, communities will not rely solely on their discarded persistence and social capital to better prepare for environmental catastrophes and natural hazards. Dr. Cuyegkeng and even Ms. Olpoc shared an invitation and I guess a challenge to interested parties to go to communities to host information sessions using language and strategies that connect to the communities. The presentation also included mapping of interactions of different subsystems. This shows that interventions to communities need to be grounded to the context on the ground. We saw how lived experiences of microenterprise communities can contribute on how we shape our own worldview on addressing and adapting to climate crisis. It is truly important to highlight other voices, other worldviews in discussion of climate change and disaster risk. Discussions, understandably, have been focused on the research of scientists and efforts and initiatives of LGUs. However, from the session and the previous ones, we saw how other voices can enrich our own insights in building a more disaster resilient community. As we draw this session to a close, we extend our utmost gratitude to Ms. Jean Hardelisa-Mijares and Mr. Daniel Ratilla, as well as the rest of the My Climate Risk Secretariat for organizing this session and the series, as well as various offices in the Ateneo and even collaborators. As we wrap up the Climate Voices on the Ground webinar series, we hope to see you in the Climate Research as if People Mattered webinar series, with the first one being on November 11th. Like similar to this series, My Climate Risk Secretariat has prepared a strong lineup of speakers with rich experiences on their work. In the next session, the focus will be on approaches towards actionable climate information as applied in different fields and research. It was a very bountiful afternoon and a bountiful month for this series. Congratulations to the organizers. Thank you everyone for your time and have a restful weekend. Stay safe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Delocado, for your closing remarks. And again, to everyone, thank you very much. We heed the challenge to go to the grassroots, to engage with various communities, with micro enterprises, with other communities that we've tackled in the past 2 sessions, so that we could really share with them and help them address their climate risk. At this point, may we request everyone to please turn your videos on for our group photo. We will give you a few moments to turn your videos on. In the meantime, maybe call on Mr. Daniel Retilia of the MCR-Ateneo team to assist us with the screenshots.
Thank you, Ms. Jean. Thank you once again to our speakers, and thank you everyone for your participation. We'll just give a few moments for the rest of the participants, our fellow participants, to turn their videos on. All right, I'm taking the first screenshot in, oh, okay. Taking the first screenshot in 3, 2, 1. Okay, and please keep your smiles on as I move on to the next page. All right, so taking this screenshot in 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's nice to see your smiles and your faces. To our dear participants, we greatly appreciate your feedback. So we really appreciate your questions, your comments earlier, and that really helped with the engaging open forum. But we'd also really appreciate your farm with the I think in a while the QR code and the link will be flashed on the screen. Requests for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form. And again, really, we could not stop saying thank you, because really thank you very much, Dr. Assunta and Ms. Raquel, for sharing your insights and your time. We would also like to thank the sign language interpreters with us this afternoon, Ms. Edna Comia and Ms. Annalisa Regis Tolentino. And to all of you, thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. We hope you have gained fresh insights on climate risk and the resilience needs of micro enterprises. Please again, don't forget to accomplish our event evaluation form. Our tech team will post the link in chat. And again, requests for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form. While this is our last session for the webinar series, at least for the year, we hope to see you again in our second webinar series, which Dr. Emma mentioned earlier. The series is titled Climate Research as If People Mattered. This particular series draws inspiration from the article Small is Beautiful, Climate Change Science as If People Mattered, written by the chairs of the My Climate Risk Hub, Regina Rodriguez and Ted Shepard. Their article reflects on insights from E.F. Schumacher's celebrated book Small is Beautiful, and what insights may be applied in closing the gap between how climate information is being produced and used. This next webinar series will have 4 sessions and will kickstart in 2 weeks on November 8th at 9 in the morning in Philippine Standard Time. We will begin the second webinar series with a session titled Storying Climate, Transdisciplinary Adventures in the Classroom and Beyond with Dr. Vandana Singh of Framingham State University in Massachusetts. You may register in the link shown on the screen. Okay, that is it for this session. Thank you again, everyone, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the day. For those in the Philippines, please stay safe and dry, and we hope to see you in our next webinar series. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.